Hey Rebels, today I want to talk about something we take for granted. It's possibly the most significant invention to be developed in our lifetimes, and it is fundamentally reshaping the way we communicate, the way we consume information and products. It's changing how we do business and how we choose to vote and select leaders in government. Possibly even more importantly, it's changing how we choose to select partners for sexual relationships and marriage. Of course, I'm talking about the internet. It was originally developed by the US military in the 1970s to create a communication network that could survive multiple nuclear weapon attacks. By 1995, the internet started to go mainstream, but even then, only 0.4% of the global population had access to some form of the internet, and it was kind of primitive. For a brief moment in history, the internet sounded like this. It's definitely made our lives easier in many ways. But on the flip side of the coin, we're still working hard to catch up to this new reality, whether it's online bullying or catfishing, identity fraud, or confidence schemes. Criminals and jerks have migrated online to take advantage of and exploit people for personal gain. But I don't think the answer is to pull the plug and turn it all off. Running and hiding in a cave and growing a really long beard is impractical, and frankly, it's insane. Today, I've invited Dr. Alec Couros, a professor from the University of Regina, who works on issues like digital literacy, cyberbullying, and cyber fraud as part of his research. I wanted to tap into his perspective on these issues and have you come away with some new ideas about our post-industrial digital economy and digital society. Alec, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How's it going?
Oh, pretty good. Yeah, this is great. I love the intro. Got me thinking a lot about my first times that I've really connected with the internet. I grew up with a non-internet Apple IIe or IIc computer. Played video games the odd time with with a 5.25-inch floppy. Those are good times. And then I actually remember in the early 1990s, I remember Peter Mansbridge coming on TV and talking about this new thing called internet.
For about $200 a year, they log on to personal computers connected to phone lines and communicate across cultures and continents. Bill Cameron has this report on the growing phenomenon of internet.
It wasn't the internet, it was just internet, and how we're going to someday come together and share recipes and talk about philosophy and that sort of thing. And it's a very different way. It's emerged in a very different way than these utopian dreams that we had. And a lot of that stuff we really alluded to in the intro. And I think it's time we really think about how this is impacting our lives in so many ways, from how it's tricking us, how it's enriching us, how it's as you mentioned, allowing us to meet the people and friendships of our dreams, to the point where it actually can be hurting our society in some really deep ways.
One of the things that led to the resurgence of craft beer, because a lot of that knowledge was lost, the internet helped spur on those recipes and the sharing of information. It's part of the reason that craft beer has made a big comeback.
And it's a phenomenon that Chris Anderson talked about, this thing called the long tail. This idea that you can actually find these little communities of doers. And I've done this in some of my classes. Like I remember there was an 8th grader in Comox, BC, who was doing a project, and he had to learn how to basically start fire with a bow drill. And rather than just going on the internet and searching for how to do it, he created a YouTube video and basically asked people out there to comment on his video. And it was interesting because some of the comments that came into this little obscure video were like, you're not doing it right, but here's ways of doing it. Like they created videos and they helped this boy do his homework essentially. But it was some of the interesting comments that struck me were like, I'm at home and I'm sitting with 4 other people who also do this bushcraft or bow drill stuff. And it was really interesting because I don't know one person on the planet does any of this stuff, and there's like little communities of people that he connected to just by using the right hashtags on a YouTube video. So it's really interesting how we can connect and how knowledge is preserved in these ways. Things that are seen, like if you're in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, and you want to listen to, some sort of Swedish death metal, you can find a community of people across the world. You may not have it at your school, but you can find people who are interested in the same thing if you think globally.
Well, let's talk about bringing globally to locally. Here's some craft beer from Rebellion Brewing. Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah.
That's good stuff.
I haven't had this one in a while. This is Rebellion's Amber Ale. It's part of our core lineup. It was one of the beers that we officially launched with on day one. And, we just don't really sing its praises. We haven't really shared any pictures or marketed it for probably 2 years. It's just one of those, stoic beers. It just keeps hitting heavy ones right out of the park, but we just don't scream and sing about it. People who are looking for big, bold, crazy IPAs, they're like, okay, Amber's nice, but I want to melt my face off. And people who want really nice, light, easy drinking beers, like maybe our Lentil or our Blast Off, they maybe shy away from the Amber, but
it's good.
I call it like a nice intro to hoppier beers.
Hitting the spot right now.
So you haven't had this one before?
I haven't, no. It's really good.
What's your first impression?
I woke up a little late this morning, so this is actually quite hitting the spot right now. So this is it's not too heavy. I mean, you mentioned some of the things that are a bit lighter and so on, but it's not that bad. It's really smooth. And I'm quite liking it.
One of the things I like to point out with this one is it might have a slight character of grapefruit from the hops. On the finish, I get a lot of caramel.
Yeah.
That comes from the hops, that malt.
For sure.
Just a really nice aroma comes off the beer. I find that if I just put my nose in it and just get a big whiff, I think it's one of the best smelling beers from Rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm liking it. Might take a few more with me.
I'll send you home so happily. One of the great things is it's pretty versatile. You can put it with like burgers and French fries and hot dogs, and you don't have to worry about pairing it. It just kind of plays nice with lots of different foods.
Yeah, I think the citrus piece really makes it for me. Yeah,
Those
nice.
hops.
Yeah, it's good.
And we would describe this as more of a West Coast style amber ale, not an English amber ale, which if you were looking at an English beer, it'd be a little sweeter, a little maltier. This one leans into the hops, but it's still got that nice creamy body that maybe you were identifying with the smooth.
Yeah.
Just gonna have another sip. Yeah, it's my wife's favorite. If I bring beer home and it's not amber, she's like, what the hell?
Yeah.
Bring some amber home. She's like, go back.
That's awesome.
So tell me about your areas of study.
Well, probably most lately I'm looking, the type of research I'm into and the types of presentations I'm asked for, I guess that are in demand, relate to, everything internet culture. Some of the more difficult stuff that I do in schools, for instance, relates around, how social media, the constant clicking and liking and, waiting for feedback, how it affects our kids and how, they're growing up in a place that's quite different than, what we grew up in. So looking for that constant affirmation from others and at the same time how social media companies play with those metrics and how they often manipulate us. They're creating these serotonin driven machines that really control us in many ways. So that's part of what I look at and trying to help young people get away and better understand the devices that the adults in the room created but most affect the kids, especially at their levels, and they're going through tough times in high school already with bullying and mean girl syndrome and all these other things that are happening to them. But then you have this amplified 1,000% to buy these phones. At the more sort of adult level, I guess, is thinking about how we make sense of the news, how we make sense of information that we get, where we get our information from, how do we discern what's truthful and what's false. And I guess the ramifications of that, of being able to, some people try to remain silent on politics, and which is fine. But at the same time, sometimes when we are silent on politics, we're not perhaps standing up for some voices that should be heard. And so there's a lot of that as well. How do we actually, contribute as citizens online? How do we not only just take in information and do something with it, but how do we also be active and secure and as citizens in the choices we make online? And with all of this, I think it's interesting to think that everything we do online is just this constant surveillance culture, right? So whether it's kids drinking underage or whatever that might look like, that's all up on the news. So I grew up in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, and we had bush parties and all sorts of other things that you were doing underage, and the difference is none of that stuff was recorded, right? And so I think it's a very different thing where every single moment of your childhood is being scrutinized and potentially used against you for your future employers. And so I think we've got to get better at that, stop being such hypocrites, I think, not thinking that some kid did something when they're 16 years old and that should affect them their entire lives, but start to think through, sort of our childhood goggles and understand that, not all these, the kids are actually all right. They're not so bad, and we have to better understand them and understand that we've created this technology that really works against them in many ways, and we have to get better at understanding that.
That was a whole lot.
That was a lot, sorry, yeah. It's the beer.
One of the very first things you talked about was the serotonin machine. I always liken it back to the Skinner boxes with the pigeons, where they would, what would they do? They'd reward the pigeon for pecking a box?
Yeah, something like that, for pecking the box, and then, was that the one that they shocked people? I'm not a psychologist, I can't remember, but I do remember,
I believe that was the Milgram-Stanford experiments.
That's what it was, yeah.
Those came, I think, separate from the Skinner boxes. They basically
they
programmed
had the screaming
chicken.
people on the other side. Yeah, that was not so good. Yeah, the Skinner boxes, I can't remember exactly, yeah.
They would reward the pigeons, but not give them a treat every time. So they just keep pecking the box, looking for that what you call maybe a dopamine or serotonin hit.
Yeah, I know the sort of the legacy of those experiments really moved into education, in terms of, reward systems around, if you look at modern education, very much of it, started sort of behaviorist and Skinnerian type systems, right? Yeah. So, and that's part of what we see in social media is, but the difference is we have, we'll get your teen girl, and I know this best because I have a 15-year-old, but, she, might take a picture of herself, put it online, and whether she admits it or not, she's waiting for some sort of system of feedback, right? And if, and I know Instagram in particular has been playing with this sort of idea where they've removed likes from certain accounts. And kids don't like that a lot because it kind of screws up their whole system, like they were, expecting something. And in some cases, it's been alleged that social media companies actually withheld likes for a while because they want you to be on screen longer. So picture that, the 15-year-old girl in Wisconsin who puts up a picture and is expecting feedback because that's what she's gotten all this time before. But the social media company wants her to come back a bit later, and they're testing their metrics and trying to figure out how we can get the most from our customers and from the advertising revenue ultimately. And we're going to withhold the feedback so that that girl in her bedroom is going back and forth and wondering why no one's giving her feedback or likes or whatever else. And then maybe 10 minutes later she decides to delete the photo because she feels defeated. So all that stuff is happening on every single Sander photo that goes up. And how is this ethical?
Is it fucking us up?
Oh yeah, absolutely, in a big way. Think about autoplay videos. Like they're actually thinking about banning autoplay and Snapchat likes. Snapchat streaks. If you're not familiar with those, basically, within a 24-hour period, consecutively over a long duration, having a streak of sending an image to someone else. And there's no doubt that that's screwing us up in big ways. It's wiring us in a way that we've never been wired before.
What do you mean? Like, what do you mean by that?
Well, I think it changes our priorities in terms of what actually matters to us, because these things are as addictive as any other drug. It works in the same way chemically as anything else. So our short-term reward systems are retweaked so that we only recognize these short-term rewards, and we're not looking long-term anymore. And that's even more difficult with young kids as well. We know that, for instance, due to brain development, kids aren't thinking long-term. At a young age, they're not thinking of the problems they might have by posting something and seeing the long-term consequences of posting something racist or just inappropriate in some way. And they're always working in the short-term period. And so they're not thinking long-term. It distracts us. It doesn't provide us with a good attention span. And then when you get to things like homework and all of the other things that we're expected to do as kids, then that becomes a real problem because you can't, pay attention to anything. And that YouTube channel out there that really did well to explain something that your teacher couldn't explain quite as well, that becomes more important. But maybe that information is wrong. You get into the fake news stuff, or that video that seems to hit all your buttons and gets you, like that person out there maybe happens to be a white supremacist video or of some sort. There's all sorts of really bad information out there for us, and that was the thing that schools, I think, did well in the long term, is that we were pretty good at filtering information, trying to decide what's good and what's worthwhile. When we think about all of the information out there, it's very difficult to know what's worthwhile and what's worth spending our time on, and what's worth spending our attention on, and what's actually going to benefit me in the long term. And that's why humans really play an important part of this information landscape.
When you talk about kids being exposed to this information, the online stuff, maybe the fake news, I hate that phrase. But
yeah, sure.
The bad information, the propaganda, the disinformation,
Mm-hmm.
You're saying it cuts short through that school filter, or schools are grappling with?
Well, schools are certainly grappling with it. I see this even at the university. There's tried and true theories and literature-backed theories and frameworks that we work with. Doctors deal with this all the time. You have doctors who have done their time at institute. We have a lot of WebMD people coming in that say, no, but I've got this. You look at things like anti-vaxxing and all sorts of other, types of dissent in terms of the way that we look at information, whether we believe science or we don't believe science, or we believe science up to the point, because this YouTuber actually made a more compelling case because he doctored a bunch of information, or he cherry-picked literature, or whatever it might be. So it's difficult for schools, for professionals to deal with some of the information, because a lot of this stuff, if you think about this, there's been all sorts of acts from the United Nations thinking that things like fake news, and it's not, and I don't like the term either, but information, the lack of information literacy, I guess, is a grave security threat in a number of different ways. If you look at things like deep fakes, for instance, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically the ability for us to fake video in a very compelling way, and there's been kind of funny ones out there, but
they had the Full House one with
Full House one, yeah, with the mustaches was fantastic. Yeah, there's a lot of really good uses of that from a comedic sense, but to the point where you get a strong, a dictator, a leader, someone saying, hey, go out into the streets. I want you to, pull up your guns because those lefties or those righties are coming to get us. And actually creating problems, like where we actually have people shooting people in the street, doing irrational things, calling them to do all sorts of, violent activities. That gets really scary to think that our technologies, because they become so difficult to discern what's true and what's real, what's fake and what's real. We're getting to the point where we just don't know truth anymore, and that it really does have some great ramifications on our society.
What are schools doing to implement this kind of media literacy? I've been screaming about this for decades.
Sure. Well, in the past, and teachers have been doing a great job, I think, with the tools that they have. But there's certain toolkits, I guess, almost checklists that are quite common that you would look at. One's called CRAP. It's like currency. I can't remember it all. Reliability, authorship, and it kind of gets you to look at a news source, and it says, who's the author? How current is this? How credible is the author? And ask you a bunch of questions, but it's really checklists. And you're
plausible.
Is it plausible? I mean, that would be, there's all sorts of other ones out there. Like, what is the purpose of this communication, for instance? And what do we know about the author? And what do we know about the information? And how can we verify it? The problem is we can't do that for everything that comes past us in any certain way. It's really difficult for us to look at those. So checklists don't work. They don't work at scale because we're doing this constantly all the time. And they don't get at the heart of the problem because it's like we don't really have a skeptic's mindset. We don't, not to look at things cynically, but look at things skeptically, to say that maybe this person, whether it's someone that you meet on the street, someone you meet on YouTube, or even your teacher, maybe they're full of it. maybe the information they have is not good, and maybe they're doing that on purpose, and maybe they're doing it because they just don't know well enough. That we have to constantly be researching these things, to be inquisitive enough to actually come to the point where I don't necessarily reject what you have to say, but I need to research it more to really make certain what you're saying has some validity to it. And so that's part of it. I think the tools haven't been so good so far.
We talk about kids. Oh, we're concerned about the kids. Oh, what about the kids? What about the old people?
Right.
Because there's a lot of internet uncles out there who are tweeting and posting a lot of crazy stuff. Like, I'm not seeing young people posting the insane nonsense so much as I'm seeing like my uncle, kind of old white dudes saying crazy indefensible stuff. And I sometimes I jump in there and here's some links to a credible source. You're posting from like a flat Earth blog or some quacky.
And I see this all the time. Bad, questionable. There's some sites that are just totally out there that you shouldn't be quoting from, and they're obvious fakes. They're part of the propaganda machine. They look, they don't even look close to being real. But we have to remember, they may be favoriting or sharing the first thing they see in their Facebook pic, and these news sources. Ultimately, the way this works on you is they basically accommodate your own belief system, right? So it's the idea that they're actually they're looking for people who already believe this stuff, and they're giving you some ammunition, I guess, for these same views. So there's a reason for it. And if you get into what we know about, say, the Russian propaganda that's happening there, and you can call me, and I want people to look up whatever I have to say, but there is some Russian state propaganda that basically, and not just from Russia, but from other places as well, that is less about supporting, say, vax movements or anti-vax movements or Black Lives Matter movements or anti-Black Lives Matters or All Lives Matters movements. It's not about that. It's about creating dissent. It's not about picking a side. It's making sure that there's chaos. And that's really at the heart of this. A lot of this is that if we supply information, bad information on both sides of any issue, especially on really controversial issues, you're going to create incredible rifts in society, and you're going to see an incredibly polarizing society.
We're talking about Compromat. We're talking about the Russians.
Yep.
One of the things that I saw prior to working in Rebellion, in brewing, was I worked in consumer protection. And we saw a lot of people, seniors, getting exploited online, either through threats of lawsuit, or they said, oh, we hacked your computer and we're going to delete all your information unless you give us money, or catfishing, stuff like that. What are you seeing with your research in regard to these issues?
So I have a special relationship to the catfishing pieces, and that's really opened up my research into areas that relate to what are called confidence schemes. So basically, it's creating a sense of confidence. So it might be, you know, it might be like a tech fraud scheme. So grandma gets a call from someone from Microsoft, and it says, "Hey, we noticed that you have a virus on your machine. We'd like you to install this." And grandma doesn't know anything about tech, but she doesn't want to bother the nephews because they're busy. And so she, you know, talks to someone on the phone, which allows her to, and the way the confidence scheme is it says, "Oh, we noticed that you have a virus. Put this on your computer. We noticed that you have also, you know, if you type in these few things, you should see this. Oh, that's a bad thing that we saw." It would be something that, you know, fits on everyone's computer, or, you know, it's very common, but because it's affirmed to them that they see something that grandma happens to see at the same time, it's created this instant trust, I guess. And so from that point, we want to make sure that, you know, you don't lose all your files, and you can still see, you know, pictures of your grandkids and so on. And we need to take control of your computer. And then we're going to, you know, charge you money. That might be one scheme, or we might lock up all of your files and then charge you ransom. We might get into your bank information and transfer money to our account because we have total access to your machine. But it all starts with some sort of confidence piece there. When we look at catfishing in particular, you know, catfishers have used my photos. There's many people's photos that they use, but they've used my photos for over 12 years with mostly middle-aged women who they contact at some point. They get into relationships, and these
like
relationships
online.
So if you think of someone who's not very internet savvy, you know, some person their age really pays attention to them, says all the things that they've always wanted to hear, and these are women who might have been divorced or separated or widowed, and they're finding something romantic. They know nothing about internet dating, and at some point, someone really pays attention to them. They're calling them on the phone, because in the 80s, that's what we did. You know, we called people on the phone. You could fall in love with people on the phone. You know, it's all you needed. You didn't need video and, you know, whatever else that comes with the Tinders and all these things. We could fall in love, and that was enough. And then at some point, that you get a great connection. Then this fake person's daughter gets sick, and you need to send money, and these things happen. And I get messages every single day from 3 or 4 people who have fallen for these schemes, who have sent money, or maybe is right before they sent money when they, you know, finally figured it out. They might have used a reverse Google image search or something. But and a lot of people, when I ask them, "Did you send money?" and some of them say yes, and some of them say no, and they say, but the bigger thing is that they've really, you know, they've fallen in love. They've totally fallen in love in these schemes, and they feel incredibly stupid and vulnerable. And sometimes they do it again, because the next scam that comes around is friends of these scammers who say, "We know that you've been catfished, and we're the police, and we're going to help you. We need you to put down this money, and we're going to help you." Like, so it's incredibly vulnerable, and these cycles of vulnerability just lead to more and more scamming, to the point where people have committed suicide. I mean, they end their lives because they've lost their house, they've lost everything that they have, even after warnings from the banks. Like, the banks are now more in tune to these things that say, "Hey, you know, don't give money. This seems really sketchy, but ultimately it's your money."
I remember banks calling my office,
right,
and saying, "We've locked down this person's account,
right, yeah,
because we consider them to be vulnerable. We've contacted their kids, who are trustees or guardians,
right,
to prevent them from sending more money."
Yeah.
And they're fighting with their kids.
Exactly. And they go around to figure out other ways to, you know, find different pockets of money to send it in different ways, or they'll take out money and they'll send it through Western Union or something. Like, they do everything they can to send it to these criminals. But we see more and more of that all the time.
Are people getting smarter? How do we stop this?
Well, I mean, more education around that is a big deal. But if you think in politics, it's just, there's a really great guide on the web. It's called the Web Literacy Guide for Student Fact Checkers. It's a free guide, and you can find it if you download it, and maybe you can put it in the show notes. I'm not sure how that works, but it's from Mike Caulfield, and he talks about several things that you would go through when you're deciphering fake news, for instance. And part of it is, knowing reputable sources, understanding the media bias of all the different sources that you get. So if you're left-leaning, for instance, you might see something like the New York Post, which is kind of but you might share it on your Facebook feed, and it's not a really great source. Or the Fox News thing, if you're more right-leaning, you may not want to share that, because that stuff can be quite theatric in many ways as well. So deciding what you share, like every adult is as much as a problem with fake news when it comes to sharing things. Because when you share something on your Facebook feed or Instagram or Twitter, you're sharing with everyone else, and you're causing a ripple effect, and you're making more and more people. And the more credible you are, the bigger the ripple, I guess, in many ways. So it's about sharing. It's about figuring out what's worth sharing, doing the homework before you share. Not sharing at all, keeping it to yourself.
I like using Snopes.
Yeah, great site. PolitiFact.
Media bias fact check.
Exactly, yeah.
These statistical websites.
Right. And that's part of this guide, is like giving you a list of those things that they've already done the work for you. And they've done research where they've actually taken like historians, scholars, like university professors against like fact checkers, and the methodology the fact checkers use is typically much better than historical knowledge, because we often play into our own biases around political leaning, right? So our political leaning is really bad when it comes to deciphering the validity of information, and so it's much more important to take a much more systematic protocol like a fact checker would, versus perhaps some non-journalistic techniques that you would see as maybe a historian, for instance, or a PhD student, for instance, might take very different approaches to something that's a more methodological approach like a fact checker.
One of my buddies posted literally 2 or 3 days ago, it was a meme, but it said, people don't want to listen unless it's your opinion coming out of their mouth.
That's right, yeah. Totally makes sense, right? And the opposite is, there's a psychological backfire effect. If you say something and I present evidence to you that argues against what you're saying,
they dig their heels in?
Yeah, they dig their heels in, and that's the backfire effect. Like, you actually not only believe it, you continue to believe it, you'll believe it even more. Like, you get to the point where you actually did no service in moving that person, toward your opinion. So even understanding how to do that, like there's research around inoculation effects of how do we actually inoculate people from fake news? How do we get them to be more systematic about the way that they decipher and analyze news in different ways, and to be ready for it?
I know you can't walk up to them and be like, "You're wrong, stupid."
Right. Yeah. That's about the worst thing you can do, right? And it creates like the intended effect. If we look into, again, Russian meddling or whatever, foreign meddling or even domestic meddling into some of these issues, is to create this divisive effect on our democratic processes.
So how do you talk to someone who is sharing something wrong or says something that's wrong? How do you approach them in a way without insulting them and getting them to dig in their heels?
Well, I think taking someone like my colleague Mark Spooner, I see him on Twitter masterfully. Like, he takes a particular opposition on Twitter, but he always gets to the point where, and you'll notice in his tweets, he always, like, he's up for coffee, he's up for conversation, he's up for something more meaningful than some of the petty transactions we see on Twitter, like where it's, I've got something, and then you present this evidence, which you probably Googled 3 seconds ago, and then the next person Googles something 3 seconds ago that, 3 seconds later that actually refutes that. Like, that's not research, that's not conversation. So inviting someone beyond that for conversation, actually having something meaningful, sitting down for a beer, like beer, coffee, whatever it might be, to actually have a much, like seeing where you actually intersect, right? Ultimately, if you think about some of the divisive problems we have in Saskatchewan, a lot of us started here. You know, we grew up in some of the same small towns. We know some of the same people in different schools. We just headed different places ideologically, but sitting down together over a beer, over a drink, just spending some time together, seeing each other's, the way that we view the world, and seeing that there's a lot of similarities. Like, that's where we need to get to. And so this requires hard work, and it requires conversation, but it's the only way that we're really going to get to a place where we can understand each other.
There's a study, I was literally reading it yesterday. It was long form, it was in the United States, and they're talking about how do we deprogram people who are white supremacist
Right.
or racist or might be leaning in that direction. They were saying one of the things they did was they salted the research. They would sprinkle in fake information, and to a group of people they said, aliens exist. You now know this is true. Aliens exist. Sentient life is out there, and they're in contact with us on Earth. And suddenly the people who were racist or discriminatory softened their position because they now felt they had more in common with humans and were more worried about the fear of what little green men might have.
Wow, yeah. That's interesting.
And I was like, this is insane.
Well, I think, that really comes back to the same point, right? I think that fits well. It's just this idea that we do have more in common, and we do have vested interests in each other's futures. To build a less violent society, a more healthy society in a lot of these ways. But that also goes back to this idea of inoculating news. When you do sprinkle in some of the things that you certainly can't believe, then you start, it's very much like that cowpox virus, I guess, or that, the dead virus inside you. You start to realize that maybe all of the things that you do believe aren't quite true, and that there's a possibility that you believe things that are just a bit far-fetched. And so once you get to the point where that mechanism kind of kicks in again, where you're actually presented with information that could be within your ideological framework, but doesn't make sense, then you can start pulling people back towards the center or towards different types of views, I guess. And this works in both ways. This is not a call for there's extremism on both sides, and the biggest challenge that we have is extremism, whether it's to the left or to the right, because that's where we're starting to see some real problems.
I have so many questions to follow.
Oh, hey, yeah, sure.
I'm stumped. Let's go back to your research. You've been doing a lot of research and talking about these issues, and what would you say would be your favorite insight that you've learned so far?
Oh boy, that's a good one. No, that's tough. Favorite insight. Some of the other stuff I haven't talked about that relates to this, though. I helped. I teach really large classes outside of my regular the courses I teach. So I've taught courses that involve up to 12,000 people. So massive open online courses, and I've been doing that for a number of years. I haven't done one for the last few years.
The MOOCs?
The MOOCs, yeah. So MOOCs, yeah. So I've taught courses like that, and the thing that to start off with those courses, the biggest thing is trying to find connections amongst people. So we've done like lip dubs and all sorts of other really kind of bonding things that we do in the early course, because if you just broadcast to 12,000 people, they're not going to feel a sense of synergy or connectedness. So a lot of the stuff that that's really been the forefront of my research has been really about connecting and working with networked learning experiences, network connections that allow us to have these similarities online. And so I guess a big part of what I'm doing with fake news is trying to develop these systems of understanding where we can connect in a way that is really, it's a utility. Like we can connect to learn, we can connect with people to take up some really interesting experiences. But when it comes to actually building strong connections, we have to do that in a closer environment. So, and that involves listening, that involves, connecting in spaces like this. Like I can have, 100,000 Twitter followers, but unless I can still feel lonely, right? I can still feel like I'm not connected. I ran into, and this is related, I promise, I ran into an older man. He was 92 years old yesterday in London Drugs. And we talked for about half an hour. Like he looked at my son who was 5. He told me his son was 67. And he just kind of looked at me, and we had a really long conversation about he grew up in Hamburg. He lived on the Baltic Sea. He was in a prison camp in Siberia. Like, we went through his entire life as a family man, as an engineer. And then he kind of ended it up, and he just looked at me and said, just remember that life is temporary. Like, everything is temporary, and that life is too short, and that you have to really cherish those moments. And it was just like this incredible moment that I had with this person. And so the biggest part for me is, like, we can have all these connections, but how do you actually make that connection, that really deep connection with one person at one point? How do we do that at scale? How do we ensure that people aren't just mindlessly clicking on boxes, that send signals to and from, like these these electrons to and from boxes across these wires? And how do we actually make this happen inside us? How do we actually create these connections? So really, it's about refining those human connections that have somewhat been romanticized, but really been lost in this internet age.
Does that happen to you often?
Not often enough. And I think the problem is we're not receptive to it. We're running from place to place. We're running to the next appointment. We're rushing in traffic. We're complaining about how people can't merge in this, zipper merge in this city or whatever it might be. We're never focused on the openness of making those connections, of just looking around, opening your eyes to the world around us, and finding opportunities to make that conversation with that stranger, who might enrich us in some real deep way at that moment, at the time that you need it.
What you just said reminded me of something that comes from my grandma. She always said, you need to actively listen and not just wait for your turn to talk.
I totally get that. That was the first and most memorable thing that I learned as a teacher. So my first teaching job was in Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. I had this rowdy group of grade 8s, and I was just floundering as a teacher. I was not doing well, and this woman by the name of Margaret, teacher, she just said, just listen, and like, you need to listen to the kids, and like in a real deep way, and it's just stuck with me. Like the listening piece is, we just talk too much. The more information we get, we talk more and more, and what we really should be doing is listening. And so listening is extended to even just being open to listening, like open and making space for people to present what they have to say in places that we might not expect. Honoring people's expertise, right? Then that becomes more important when you're in the institution where you're surrounded by PhDs who have spent their lives being experts, whether they feel that way or not, but they've spent their lives, tuning their mastery of certain areas. We have to make sure that we connect to people that have educated themselves in as important and very rich and deep ways in other sectors, who don't have the credential, but who have spent a lifetime learning things and have a lot to tell you.
That's awesome. I think that would be the solution to propaganda, disinformation, bar fake news.
I would say it makes a big difference, right? It's huge, yeah.
On the lighter side, we now see kids coming up. A couple weeks ago, they just won like millions of dollars playing video games.
Right. Oh, I saw that, yeah.
And there was a study, a quiz that went out and said to kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? And for the last 40 years prior to the 1990s, aughts, it was, I want to be a policeman, fireman, that kind of thing, a helper. And now it's, I want to be a YouTuber. Yeah,
no, it's huge. It's huge in my house. Even I have my 12-year-old boy looked at, because he plays Fortnite.
Yeah.
And so he was like, this is amazing. This is what I want to do. And I have a, she was 4, she's now 8, but she's been a YouTuber since she's been 4, or at least she's tried to get on YouTube to do, she's just totally taken by makeup videos, that sort of thing. Because people can do this, they can put it online, and it's the same sort of system. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like I don't think you're not going to see a lot of people successful as YouTubers. That's just, I mean, the bare facts. You just don't. It's kind of an interesting career. But you also have to, like, the dark side of that, besides the money and stuff, there's what was her name again? The awkward girlfriend. She was a meme for a while. And she was like the awkward girlfriend. You'll have to look it up. But she just came out about her mental health. She started out as, she created videos on YouTube, and she was the awkward girlfriend. And so she actually just released a video about her mental health and how she had been just, trying to figure out how to create these weekly videos and the intense pressure that she had around this, and then she showed some of her things that she never, that she created over the years, but she never had the courage to actually put out there, about how she was just struggling with this. And you see issues like that. I think it was Logan Paul or one of those guys. I mean, they make mistakes all the time. They're in I think it was Logan Paul. He was in he decided to vlog from a hanging garden in Japan where people commit suicide and so on. Yeah, the suicide forest. And he had posted that, and of course there's also the flack for that. And I mean, I don't think he really fully apologized, but there's all sorts of like really horrible things that these guys do. But I think at the forefront there's a lot of tremendous pressure to produce and to do more ridiculous things all the time. Like I ran into a young kid who put out a fluke YouTube video, got millions of hits for whatever reason, like just because it wasn't good. It was just the right person who was a celebrity, happened to retweet it. And then he became incredibly sad because he couldn't reproduce the number of likes and hits. So he was like jumping off his house in rural Saskatchewan, like trying to figure out the most ridiculous thing he could do to actually get people to like him, like ultimately, So there's a lot to that. But, if we want to reproduce that in our schools, I think all the things that a good YouTuber does, communication skills, the ability to edit videos really well, to make a compelling message, like let's train them as YouTubers. Like there's so much in the English language arts curriculum. There could be, whether you're a mathematician or science, there's lots of really great science bloggers, math bloggers, all of those things that we can do to communicate a message, to think about how we can communicate a message to a global community, way more powerful than handing something in to your teacher or putting it up on the bulletin board so someone might just happen to see it, right? So if we think globally and if we really take that passion, maybe you'll never be a YouTuber, but let's build up all those skills, because all those skills that a YouTuber has in the way that they create their messages and make it succinct and concise and they communicate it well, let's teach kids that, and let's equip them for that. And if they happen to become YouTubers, fantastic. I think that would be great.
I was going to ask you what is a policy piece for helping kids, but I think you just nailed it.
I hope so. I mean, there's also something I wrote, if you want to put in it's called the SAS Digital Citizenship Policy Guide. So if you're a parent that's looking at, thinking about their own kids and what they should be doing online, I mean, you can contact me as well. I'm pretty approachable. I do speak to a lot of parents and parent groups about their kids, and whether it's related to Snapchat, like that's one of my passions, is really talking to parents and helping them engage with, right now the big thing is TikTok, right? Trying to figure out TikTok communities and what's good about it, what's bad about it, what their kids are going to see, how they're going to be influenced. But ultimately, we need to know what's going on with kids online. So I'm always happy to communicate with parents for that. But also, if you're interested in just getting a better sense of how do we make sense of news, always happy to talk to parent groups, anyone, over a phone call, whatever it might be. Just because we've got to get better at this. Like we're really at a point where we're at a tipping point where we just don't believe anything that's happening, and there's such a rift in society. And we have to understand that this is being done to us, and we can fight back. So let's do that. Let's bring back that, that utopian view of the internet where we can, share philosophies and cooking tips and, craft beer, whatever it might be. Let's get back to that point, because I think there was something magic about that time, and I think we can get back there.
Rebels, thanks for listening. I'm going to include links within the show notes so you can find more about Dr. Alec's work and his research. I'm going to include links to that web literacy guide for student fact checkers by Mike Caulfield. I highly encourage you to check it out. I'm also proud to let you know that the Rebellion Brewing podcast is an affiliate member of the Saskatchewan Podcast Network. If you're into podcasts and you're looking for great content produced right here in our province, the Sask Podcast Network is a great one-stop shop to discover local stories to listen to. Here's a clip from Sean Broom with the story of you.
Did you have, and we'll get to Fred Penner's Place and all of that, but as you were coming up as a children's performer and then, into Fred Penner's Place, did you have any idea as to how impactful your work was on so many people? Did you grasp like the scope of it and how many people were being reached by it?
A little bit. Because the performances that I was doing, in that time frame were huge. Like sold out shows for a couple of thousand people at the Cleary Auditorium in Windsor, and the Jubilee Auditoriums.
You can find Sean Broom's show on the Sask Podcast Network. Just go to saskpodcastnetwork.com. As always, if you want to find the latest news about Rebellion Brewing, be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Untapped. Untapped is like Facebook for beer. And you can send us direct information and feedback every time you have one of our beers. Thank you for joining the Rebellion.